I've been asked to talk a bit about designing with placekeeping in mind. And I'm going to pick up on quite a few of the themes that Nicola has already highlighted in her slot. But in many ways, this is about integrated design. It's about placemaking, it's about placekeeping, and about place programming. Here's a picture of King's Cross, recently opened coal drops, familiar to some. But an increasing need to integrate planning and design, management, maintenance into a much more holistic approach than perhaps we have done in the past. Our country is well blessed with some phenomenal urban parks, gifted to us in many ways by Victorian Park movement, built principally to address environmental challenges of a rapidly industrialising society, but also principally to tackle issues of public health and also to look at enhancing land values and using it as a mechanism for urban development. And so parks have been a central part of placemaking for centuries, but they also come with quite a wide variety of place-keeping challenges. And in many ways, that continuing desire to maintain that almost Victorian pastoral idyll is becoming increasingly difficult. But our parks continue to evolve, and we can look forward to modern park making internationally with some phenomenal and inspiring examples, not least here in near Docklands with the Queen Elizabeth Olympic Park. We have seen some immensely beautiful but also incredibly intelligent approaches to try and shape and design our urban landscapes to be more functional and more productive. And here the handiwork of James Hitchmo and Sarah Price on the planting, James being a colleague of Nicola, creating landscapes that do new things for new communities. And that is all well and good, but many places have considerable challenges because that Victorian legacy and endowment comes with considerable challenges for upkeep and maintenance. And we see the infrastructure of many of our urban parks across the country struggling to respond to many of the financial challenges that particularly this decade has brought for us. We're also seeing parks in communities that are changing, communities that have new desires, new drivers in many ways, and that urban green infrastructure has possibly become outmoded or outdated. And the argument for management and maintenance, the placekeeping resources, becomes much harder under these circumstances. And some choose to perhaps step away and to minimise those upkeep challenges across our urban parks. A retrenchment in many ways where you end up with a minimal set of resources for minimal public value. And so I think this decade has been a phenomenally interesting one for taking the urban parks agenda forwards, but to increasingly integrate the design process of placemaking with the challenges of placekeeping. And it gives us an opportunity to rethink parks. And it gives us an opportunity to look at the state of UK public parks, two pieces of work I've had the benefit of being involved in understanding what the key challenges and key drivers are for urban public parks at this stage. I think this is a decade driven by revenue, whereas perhaps the last decade with the high watermark of the Queen Olympic Park was one of capital. And so these difficulties also bring great opportunities because they push people to do new things and grasp new practice and increasingly look further afield to where the models work. Where is the new opportunities? Where is the inspiration? And so I am going to draw on 5 key areas, themes that we pulled out with the work for the Heritage Fund, previously Heritage Lottery Fund, on the on the State of UK Public Parks that was published a couple of years ago. We continue to look at the role of local authorities in terms of public sector funding, but also leading and managing. But there is a greater opportunity to bring new players and new organisations into the mix, which brings many a new opportunity. We want to look at how we integrate and empower and support communities in a much more strategic manner than we do at this point of time. The role of volunteering came up and was flagged by Nicola, but I want to say just a bit more about that. We want to look at new models of funding and management, and funding is central to this, but the debate and the solutions are much more mixed and much more varied. And we want to be much more efficient and smart about how we use data and the amount of information that is increasingly becoming available. So I'm going to canter through these 5 areas because I think they provide some interesting lessons, interesting examples, which I think are worth highlighting. The role of public sector leadership is still increasingly important, and whilst austerity has somewhat limited the influence and power of local authorities, there are opportunities still to take a strategic lead. You can take examples, say, here in Chicago, with a clear strategic plan for action for the Chicago Parks District, driven by 4 things. It's about delivering parks for kids first. It is about the best deal in town, providing parks as a social service for a range of activities and skills and social support for communities. It's about building to last, but also about making that extra effort in delivering in different ways. It's a picture here of one of my favourite landscapes. I'm going to slightly deviate here, but this is Alfred Cordwell's Lily Pond. It's one of the preeminent, most significant examples of prairie planting. And Caldwell stepped in to refurbish it in 1938. And I know I'm going off script here, but it was the budget, as many a landscape architect knows, was cut just towards the end of the refurbishment, and particularly when the planting, which was moving from more of an exotic planting to an ecologically driven prairie planting, was being really cut back. Alfred Caldwell is a hero. He cashed in his life insurance policy, bought all the plants and planted it. That's a footnote and off script. I'm coming back on script. Looking at leadership as well, it's really interesting where you see, say, in Berlin, a strategic model with Grüne Berlin to coordinate the strategic management of key parks. Because in many ways, local authorities have quite a complex hierarchy, but there are premier parks in our big towns and cities. And in Berlin, you have this model of an organisation that focuses particularly on the programming investment of their core central parks, and have structured that through planning and design, but also through management and through event scheduling. So the leadership and the structure of local authority and public sector, I think, is incredibly important. The roles of partnerships also come up really strongly, and everyone talks about partnerships both as an opportunity and a particular challenge. But I start here with an example from Central Park in Barking and Dagenham, hit significantly and not far from here with austerity, but a much more coordinated and integrated programme of landscape use, park use, with growing communities. Here the starter farm taking over the previous depot of Barking and Dagenham's park service, where they are now running a range of social enterprise models, including Grown in Dagenham programme for single parents, and school children on food growing, funded through veg box schemes. You also see a strategic relationship, say here with Woodbury Wetlands, where the London Wildlife Trust and Thames Water come together to draw in the opportunity of repurposing two key reservoirs, reforming historic buildings, but working with the private sector on trying to integrate through different areas of interest, through voluntary and community organisations, environmental organisations, but also the private sector, to invest and reform public parks. And again, you can take an example in Manchester with Eat Pennines, a social enterprise. Eat is employment and training Pennines, taking kids out of school to introduce skills within hospitality industries through a various number of outlets, including the key public parks in Manchester, and particularly Heaton Park, where they are running the cafes but starting to grow food within a productive community garden. So partnerships are key, but also that role of working with communities. And I take two examples here. One is the Neal Parks Trust, where they are strategically working in a much more coordinated and structured way with their volunteers, providing a whole range of training opportunities, but also looking at the range of offers that are provided through working more collaboratively with their communities. And if you go onto the Neal Park website, it gives you a lot of information on how they have structured working with communities and volunteers in a much more coordinated and longer term strategic manner. I take this little example also of working with niche communities. And here we have Biby. It's a social enterprise in Copenhagen. I had the benefit of visiting them about 18 months ago, where they are working particularly with immigrant communities, in this case Syria and Afghanistan, on beekeeping across a large number of the city's parks as a means on social integration, social empowerment, but also a self-funded social enterprise. And yes, you can buy different types of honey named after all the different types of parks in Copenhagen, and you can buy them at Biby or at the airport. I'm on number 4 here, so we're getting there, Nicola. Structuring the management organisations, I think, are also interesting. And I take two examples. First, the Western Sydney Parklands, a management organisation which is a development organisation as well. It is a trust for Western Sydney which is growing rapidly, but is a structure that is investing heavily in income generating assets to fund long-term management. And so the planning and design is an integral part of the business model for managing the parklands in the long term. And this alternative model is also being explored by Newcastle. And so we will expect in April, just next month, the final launch of their Parks Trust to independently manage the majority of their key urban parks and also their allotments across the city. But that partnership model also works in the private sector, and that relationship that King's Cross has, for example, with not only design, but careful estate management, but also careful programming. And I conclude by a much more efficient and smart use of data. And when you look, say, for example, with the Parks Trusts, and here is the annual report, Milton Keynes Parks Trusts, we can see a much more detailed analysis of the resourcing required, particularly funded through now endowments for parks. So a really useful structure on business modelling. We are also seeing other parks starting to engage much more strategically with ecosystem services. So here we have a table of the environmental services that Parks Tacoma in Seattle have been using, with a structure across the different landscape types. And how to do that, and how, say, for example, to capture those ecosystem services for health benefits is something that we've been starting to explore. The Mersey Forest, with Paul Nolan and myself working with the Council of St Helens to try and configure future parks management with much greater parks health benefit. And so here we have a diagram of the parks of the city, and then through GIS analysis that the Mersey Forest has undertaken, looking at recreation and amenity, looking at all the health services that the green infrastructure assets across the city provide, overlaying those with the network of parks, starts to identify those parks which provide or have the potential to provide greater public health benefits. And it is an agenda that is coming much more prominent, including the press last week on the Times. And so I think this is a good point to now pass across to look at how we use this data, and particularly the natural capital accounting, in more detail for capturing health benefits to support future management. Thank you very much.